It was September of 1811. A horse-drawn carriage rolled slowly up to the gates of Aswarby Hall, deep in the heart of Lincolnshire, and inside sat a small boy, alone. The moment the carriage stopped, he jumped out. His eyes moved quickly, sharp, curious, taking in everything. The tall red brick house, the tall narrow windows, glowing like embers in the evening light, the oak trees standing dark against a fading sky. From somewhere deep in the trees, a church clock struck 6. The sound drifted on the breeze and faded. It was a pleasant scene, on the whole, but there was something in the early autumn evening that gave it a faint touch of sadness, and that was exactly the feeling the boy carried with him as he stood in the porch waiting to be let in. His name was Stephen Elliot. He was 11 years old, and 6 months earlier he had been left an orphan. Now, thanks to a generous offer from his elderly cousin, a Mr. Abney, he had come to live at Aswarby Hall. The offer had surprised everyone who knew Mr. Abney, because he had a reputation as a stern, solitary man, the kind whose quiet, ordered household was the last place anyone would expect a young boy to fit into. What Mr. Abney actually did with his time, very few people knew. A professor of Greek at Cambridge had once remarked that no one in England knew more about the religious beliefs of the ancient pagans than the owner of Aswarby Hall. His library held every available book on ancient mystery religions, the Orphic poems, the worship of Mithras, and the Neoplatonist philosophers. In the marble-floored entrance hall stood a striking sculpture of the god Mithras slaying a bull, which Mr. Abney had brought from the Levant at considerable expense. He was, in short, a man buried in his books. So it had come as a great surprise when he not only became aware of his orphaned young cousin, Stephen Elliot, but actually invited the boy to come and live with him. Whatever his neighbors had expected, Mr. Abney seemed genuinely pleased to welcome the boy. The moment the front door was opened, he came rushing out of his study, rubbing his hands together with what looked like delight. "How are you, my boy? How are you? How old are you?" He caught himself. "That is, you're not too tired from your journey to eat your supper, I hope." "No, thank you, sir," said Stephen. "I'm quite well." "Good lad. And how old are you, my boy?" It was a little strange. He had already asked the same question, barely 2 minutes into their first meeting. "I'll be 12 on my next birthday, sir." "And when is your birthday, my dear boy?" "The 11th of September. Eh? Good. Very good. Nearly a year from now, isn't it? I like to... Ha ha. Ha. I like to write these things down in my book. You're sure it's 12? Quite certain?" "Yes. Quite sure, sir." "Very well. Very well. Take him to Mrs. Bunch's room, Parks, and see that he gets his tea." Mrs. Bunch was by far the warmest and most human person Stephen had met at Aswarby. She made him feel completely at ease almost immediately, and within a quarter of an hour they were the best of friends. Mrs. Bunch had been born nearby, some 55 years before Stephen's arrival. She had lived at the hall for 20 of those years. If anyone knew the ins and outs of this house, it was her, and she was more than happy to share what she knew. There was certainly plenty at the hall that Stephen wanted explained. Who had built the small temple at the end of the Laurel Walk? Who was the old man in the portrait on the staircase, sitting at a table with a skull beneath his hand? Mrs. Bunch had answers for most of his questions, but there were others. where her answers left something to be desired. One November evening, Stephen sat by the fire in the housekeeper's room, turning things over in his mind. Is Mr. Abney a good man? He suddenly asked. Will he go to heaven? Good. Bless the child, said Mrs. Bunch. The master is as kind a soul as I've ever known. Didn't I ever tell you about the little boy he took in off the streets? Oh, that must be 7 years ago now. And the little girl, 2 years after I first came here? No. Tell me about them, Mrs. Bunch. Now, right this minute. Well, said Mrs. Bunch, settling in. The little girl? I don't remember as much about her. The master brought her back with him one day from his walk. The poor thing had no one belonging to her. She lived with us for about 3 weeks, and then one morning she was up and gone. Not a sign or trace of her have I seen since. Mrs. Bunch paused, as though the memory still unsettled her. The master was dreadfully upset and had all the pawns dragged, but my belief is she was taken by those gypsies, because there was singing around the house for nearly an hour the night she disappeared, and Parks swore he could hear voices calling in the woods all that afternoon. Poor dear, she was a quiet, odd little thing, very still in her ways, but I was wonderfully fond of her. And what about the little boy? Said Stephen. Ah, that poor boy. Mrs. Bunch sighed. He was a foreigner, called himself Giovanni. He came around the drive one winter day, turning his hurdy-gurdy. The master had him in straight away and asked him all sorts of questions. Very kind, but it went the same way with him. One fine morning, just the same as the girl, gone. A heavy silence settled between them. We puzzled over it for a good year afterward, she added quietly, because he never took his hurdy-gurdy with him, and there it sits, on the shelf, to this day. Stephen spent the rest of that evening attempting, without much success, to coax a tune out of the old hurdy-gurdy. That night, he had a strange dream. At the far end of the corridor, where his bedroom was, there was an old bathroom, out of use for years, kept locked, but the upper half of the door was glazed, and since the muslin curtains had long since been removed, you could look through and see inside. On the night in question, Stephen found himself, or dreamed he found himself, standing at that glazed door, looking through. Moonlight poured in through the bathroom window, and in its cold silver light, he could see a figure lying in the bath. The figure was impossibly thin, a dull, leaden color, wrapped in something like a burial shroud. Its lips were twisted into a faint and dreadful smile. Its hands were pressed tight against its chest, over its heart. As he stared, a low, barely audible moan seemed to come from those thin lips. Then the arms began to move. The terror of it drove Stephen backwards, and he woke. He was standing on the cold wooden floor of the corridor, in the full light of the moon, with a courage that is rare in a boy of his age. He walked to the bathroom door to see if what he had dreamed was really there. It was not. He went back to bed. The following evening, the usual quiet gathering of Stephen and Mrs. Bunch was broken by the unexpected arrival of Mr. Parks, the butler, who normally kept very much to himself in his pantry. He was agitated, more flustered than was his habit. The master can fetch his own wine of an evening if he pleases, he announced. Either I do it during the day, or not at all. Well, Mr. Parks, you know what the hall is like for rats. I'm not saying it isn't, but tonight If I'd lowered myself to put my ear to the door of the far bin, I think I could have made out what they were saying. Oh, Mr. Parks, I haven't the patience for your nonsense. Rats talking in the wine cellar. All I'm saying is, he said quietly, if you care to go to the far bin and put your ear to the door, you can test my words right now. In truth, Stephen knew perfectly well that this had not started as a joke, and so we come to March 24th, 1812. It was a restless, unsettled day, windy and full of noise, the kind of day that fills a house and garden with a feeling of unease. As Stephen stood by the fence at the edge of the grounds, looking out across the park, he had the strange sensation that an endless, invisible procession was sweeping past him on the wind. Lost souls, carried forward against their will, desperately reaching for something solid, something living, something that could anchor them back to the world they had once belonged to. After lunch, Mr. Abney called him aside. Stephen, my boy, do you think you could come to me tonight at 11 o'clock in my study? I'll be occupied until then, but I want to show you something that concerns your future, something very important for you to know. Don't mention it to Mrs. Bunch or anyone else in the house. This was a thrilling piece of news. Stephen had never been allowed to stay up until 11. On his way upstairs that evening, he glanced through the library door and saw something that gave him pause. The iron brazier that usually sat in the corner had been moved out in front of the fireplace. An old silver gilt cup stood on the table, filled with red wine. Several sheets of handwritten paper lay nearby. Mr. Abney was leaning over the brazier, sprinkling incense from a small silver box. He didn't seem to notice Stephen pass by. The wind had dropped completely by nightfall. The night was still. The moon was full. At around 10 o'clock, Stephen stood at his open bedroom window, looking out across the countryside. The silence was deep, but it was not quite empty. From somewhere across the nearby stretch of water came strange cries, sounds like something lost and desperate, wandering in the dark. They might have been owls or water birds, but they didn't sound quite like either, and they seemed to be getting closer. Now they came from the nearer bank, and then, moments later, they seemed to drift through the shrubberies just below. Then they stopped. Stephen was just considering shutting the window and going back to his book when he saw them. Two figures standing on the gravel terrace along the garden side of the hall. A boy and a girl standing side by side, looking up at the windows. Something in the way the girl stood, something in the shape of her, brought back with horrible clarity his dream of the figure in the bath. But it was the boy who filled him with the sharper fear. The girl stood still, a faint smile on her lips, her hands pressed together over her heart. The boy was thin, with dark hair and ragged clothes. He raised his arms above his head in a gesture that seemed at once threatening and unbearably desperate, as if some terrible hunger had never been fed. The moonlight fell on his hands, and Stephen could see that his nails were unnaturally, horribly long, and that the light almost shone through them. And as the boy held his arms up, something became visible on his left side, a dark and gaping wound where his chest should have been. And into Stephen's mind, not through his ears, but directly into his mind, came the echo of one of those desolate, hungry cries he had been hearing all evening across the park. Then the two figures moved swiftly, and without a sound, across the dry gravel, and were gone. Terrified as he was, Stephen forced himself to pick up his candle and go downstairs. The hour Mr. Abney had set was almost here. The study opened off the main hall on one side. Stephen, driven forward by fear more than courage, reached it quickly, but getting in was harder than expected. The door wasn't locked. The key was on the outside, as always, but his repeated knocking got no response. Mr. Abney was inside. He was speaking. And then, why was he trying to cry out? Why did the cry die in his throat? Then, silence. Stephen pushed the door open. Papers were found on the table in Mr. Abney's study. Papers that explained everything. Once Stephen Elliott was old enough to understand them, the most important passages read as follows. It was a belief widely and firmly held by the ancients, in whose wisdom I have come to place great confidence, that through the performance of certain rituals, a man may achieve a remarkable awakening of his spiritual powers, specifically by absorbing the souls of a certain number of fellow human beings. An individual may gain complete dominion over the spiritual forces that govern the elemental world. To testing the truth of this method, I have devoted the better part of the last 20 years. The first I accomplished with the removal of one Phoebe Stanley, a girl of gypsy background, on March 24th, 1792. The second, with the removal of a wandering Italian boy named Giovanni Paoli, on the night of March 23rd, 1805. The final subject must be my cousin, Stephen Elliott. His appointed day is March 24th, 1812. The required method is to remove the heart from the living subject, reduce it to ashes, and mix those ashes with approximately a pint of red wine. Mr. Abney was found in his chair, his head thrown back, his face fixed in an expression of rage, terror, and mortal agony. On the left side of his chest was a savage, gaping wound. His heart had been torn out. There was no blood on his hands. The long knife lying on the table was perfectly clean. A coroner later concluded that he must have been attacked by some wild animal, perhaps a wildcat that had entered through the open study window. But Stephen Elliott, after reading those papers, came to a very different conclusion.